Hi, this is Corey Franklin with Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. And tonight we have one of those obituary coincidences that we have so often. In the two prominent names in the conservative wing of the American politics died within one day of each other. The first was Andrew Breitbart, and here's a CNN announcement of his unexpected death at the age of 43.
Right-wing blogger Andrew Breitbart dead at the age of 43. Breitbart was certainly a driving force in the Tea Party movement, as well as a very influential political voice on the internet, heading up his own website after helping to run Drudge Report and launch the Huffington Post.
Andrew Breitbart grew up in the privileged environment of West Los Angeles, where there were a lot of liberals. He started out as a liberal. He used to joke that he became a conservative as a result of his experience in Hebrew school. I don't know whether it's true or not, but it makes for a good story.
I was bar mitzvahed, let me think, 1982. What is it, 29 years ago, University Synagogue at the corner of Saltaire and Sunset. And I was kicked out of Hebrew school, I kid you not, by Rabbi Freely and Cantor Freilich. And in hindsight, I think that's where the battle started with me and the liberal Jewish community. I'm so glad I spoke out of turn in Hebrew school. And I remember my father, Gerald Breitbart, around the same era, the last time we went to University Synagogue, I remember him pulling me. He said, "We're getting the hell out of here."
He became a conservative, and as Wolf Blitzer noted, he worked for Matt Drudge, and then he helped found the Huffington Post. Regardless of what you think of Andrew Breitbart's politics, and he was involved in several well-publicized dust-ups with the liberal community over the defunding of Acorn and several other contretemps, he did help change the relationship between the blogosphere and the internet and mainstream politics and help reconfigure its relationship with the mainstream media. He was a clever guy, and he had a penchant for showmanship. If you're a liberal, you should miss him as a foil, and if you're a conservative, you should miss him as a spokesman. One other interesting thing about Andrew Breitbart is he was the son-in-law of Orson Bean, one of my favorite comedians of all time. He was a staple in the 1950s on the quiz shows, including To Tell the Truth. He was a frequent host on Johnny Carson's show as a fill-in, and he also did a great episode of Twilight Zone called Mr. Beavis. So Andrew Breitbart, son-in-law of Orson Bean, has died, and independent of your political persuasion, you should miss him. Well, if Andrew Breitbart was the merry prankster of contemporary conservatism, then a more serious conservative was James Q. Wilson. James Q. Wilson died recently at the age of 80, and Daniel Moynihan once called him the smartest man in America. He was born in California, and he was educated variously at the Redlands, University of Chicago, and he taught at Harvard, UCLA, Pepperdine, and Boston College. He actually started out a liberal also. He worked for Hubert Humphrey in the campaign of 1968, but gradually his philosophies changed. He wrote books on the moral sense. He was a criminologist. He was a social scientist. And he was a very, very serious scientist in terms of looking at data and analyzing trends. He is most famous for his broken window theory, which has revolutionized the way we approach crime in the United States. Here's a brief snip from a documentary which describes James Wilson's broken window theory in its essence.
His classic work, Thinking About Crime, renowned social scientist James Q. Wilson observed that disorder and crime are usually inextricably linked, that human behavior is profoundly affected by its environment. Broken windows, graffiti, drunkenness, and open displays of unfettered sexuality are an invitation for crime, a declaration that the environment is uncontrolled and uncontrollable, and that anyone can invade it to do whatever damage and mischief the mind suggests. Almost like clockwork, when this broken window effect is reversed and these elements are removed or suppressed within a community, crime rates plummet. An ordered and more dignified atmosphere encourages civility and moral behavior.
Wilson's theory was first published in the Atlantic magazine in the early 1980s, and although some people today still dispute it, it is widely practiced in major cities in the United States, and you see its effect in increased police presence and television cameras in formerly high crime areas. Here is Wilson with about an 8-minute speech describing the broken windows theory, how he came up with it, and he's intellectually honest because he admits that it is not widely accepted by everybody and is not completely proven, but I think he explains it very well.
4 years ago, I went to visit the Salvation Army mission in Skid Row and spent a day with them in the mission and walking the streets. And I was struck by how massive the problem of the homeless had become. You could not walk down the streets without stepping over people in sleeping bags. You watched open-air drug sales. And the missions there, run by the Salvation Army and several other organizations, were struggling mightily to cope with this problem. I thought to myself 4 years ago, what would a patrol officer do if faced with this problem? Walking these streets, he might make an arrest for drinking in public, or sleeping in public, or walking the sidewalk. But if he made that arrest or issued that citation, he would look down the block and see 30 or 40 other people doing exactly the same thing. And reasonably would conclude to himself or herself, what I do here can make no difference. Moreover, arresting a homeless person is a messy problem. They don't smell well, and their trash should be handled while dressed in hazmat clothing. Therefore, it's not surprising that the police, not only in Los Angeles, but the police in most large cities, increasingly focus their efforts on dealing with major crimes, answering 911 calls, driving around in squad cars, and attempting to deal with serious crimes where a big arrest might make a big difference, whereas an arrest or a citation of the homeless on these streets could make no difference at all. Last Monday, I visited this same area again and walked around these streets with some patrol officers from the Central Bureau. It was striking to me what the change had been. There was a dramatic reduction in the number of homeless people. They were not absent, they were there, but nothing like what I saw 4 years ago. There were no tents, and the crime rate statistics for this area suggest the crime rates have dropped dramatically. What changed? Well, many things changed. Some things have not changed and remain on the agenda for change. But 50 or more patrol officers were assigned to this area to walk the streets and to enforce the key rules. No public drinking, no sleeping on the streets, no blocking sidewalks, no aggressive begging. And they did so in cooperation with the many missions located there, so that if somebody was to be dealt with, there would be first an effort to find a place where they could sleep. There was no problem in finding a place where they could eat because the missions were always open for food. The bed supply was sometimes adequate, sometimes inadequate. Supplementing their efforts were the safety officers dressed in red T-shirts, which have extended the reach, the sound, the sight, the smell of the police department and helped them understand what is happening and help them manage it. Now, this experience that 4 years ago to last Monday repeats an experience that George Kelly and I and others have seen in New York City and many other places. When Chief Bill Bratton directed the Transit City Police in New York City, he discovered a system in which the subway cars were covered with graffiti, in which turnstile jumpers were easily evading paying the $1.15 fare necessary to enter the subway system. And these problems presented exactly the same problems as the homeless in Skid Row. Why arrest one turnstile jumper? It would make little sense. It would tie you up for several hours completing that one arrest. What would happen? Nothing. Somebody might get a night in jail at most. Ending graffiti, well, graffiti is offensive to some, pleasing to others. What difference does it make if the graffiti are on the car? And besides, how do you end it? Chief Bratton then, working with other people, decided that the graffiti had to go and the turnstile jumpers had to be arrested. And when he arrested the turnstile jumpers, he discovered something very interesting. Many of them were wanted on warrants for offenses far more serious than evading subway fares in New York City. Just as people who have been arrested in Skid Row areas of Los Angeles in many cases have warrants indicating they have committed far more serious offenses in the city of Los Angeles. The result of the Transit City experience was that suddenly graffiti-free cars and an orderly management of entrance, the full payment of the $1.15 fare, which was then charged, made the transit authority more attractive to the average person. And use of the transit system went up, and crime rates in the transit system went down. To manage the problem of arresting one person and spending 2 hours booking that person, they would hold a group of arrestees in the subway system behind some restraints and then move them out in groups in buses so that all could be booked simultaneously. The major lesson of the Transit Authority Police, and I think the major lesson of the experience in Skid Row, is that public order is valuable. It is valuable to the citizens of New York and Los Angeles and indeed every other city simply because people feel more comfortable living in a community where when they go out on the streets, they feel that the decent people are in charge, that there is not graffiti, that there is not aggressive solicitation for fines, that people do not sleep on the streets, that people do not drink and act in a disorderly manner. And because they make the streets safer, that is to say more orderly, the people, I think, respond affirmatively. The other reason is that if you increase public order, George Kelly and I had suggested this may well drive down the crime rate. Whether or not this is true has not been adequately tested. But the one major test of it, done by Anthony Braga and his colleagues from the Kennedy School of Harvard in Jersey City, selected a group of precincts and tried various elements of what George and I called the broken window strategy, what they called the maintenance of public order, to see if the reduction, the improvement in order in those precincts where the experiment was tried would bring down the crime rate compared to those where the experiment was not tried. And they concluded, not using the phrase broken windows and not really talking about the argument Kelly and I made, that it did. That is to say that improved public order brought down the crime rate. Whether this is true in other places remains to be seen. Most cities do not change their police strategies on the basis of an experimental doctrine. They're far too busy coping with the reality of the problems around them than would be implied by their efforts to test theories of a couple of distant and possibly crackpot social scientists. It's unfortunate because we cannot then say with confidence that the public order strategy, when applied in every large city, will result in all or most cases in a reduction in crime. But the key situation changed. That is to say, the transit police and later the quality of life strategy, policing strategy in New York City, under changes that have occurred in Skid Row and Los Angeles, support the view that there is a relationship between improving public order and a reduction in crime. The reduction in crime in Los Angeles was not the result of really harsh police tactics. I spent some time with a couple of officers who, although they could easily take the exam for sergeant and move indoors and fill out forms all the time, prefer to be senior lead officers and remain on the street where the action is. Generally what they do is simply stand there and talk to them. And they talk to them, in my experience, in a compassionate and understanding way. Making it clear what the rules are, making it clear that if they don't follow the rules, unfortunate things may happen, giving them time to sort out their lives.
So that is the essence of the broken window strategy that James Wilson was the author of. One of the prime advocates of the broken window strategy was Mayor Rudolph Giuliani in New York City.
Fixing broken windows said that you had to pay attention to those things, that in ignoring them, you were creating the mega problems that were being used almost as an excuse for not dealing with the small problems.
Here's Wall Street Journal columnist Holman Jenkins on the broken windows theory and James Q. Wilson.
That was actually the title of a 1982 Atlantic Monthly article that he wrote with a colleague at the time when he was on the board of the Police Foundation. It actually went back to a study in the New York area where sociologists would park a car on the streets, leave it for a few days and see what happened. What they discovered was it wasn't the investigator himself came and broke the first window that the car was then quickly vandalized. The lesson from this was once there are signs that social order is not being enforced, everything goes to heck in a hurry. And that became the basis for this argument about a new way of policing, which was to keep the panhandlers off the street, repair the broken windows, fix the streetlights, give the public and the criminals a sense that somebody cared and was paying attention. And this became the basis for a big revolution in policing in the 80s and 90s. Interestingly enough, Wilson was relentlessly empirical, and he says that while broken windows changed the attitude of policemen and helped them build new bridges to the public they were trying to serve, it did not have much to do with reducing the crime rate. In fact, Rudy Giuliani's police commissioner, William Bratton, was a big fan of broken windows, and yet what Wilson told me was that it was an innovation of Bratton's really that did New York's decline in crime, and that was in targeting the crime rate. Previously, police had tried to solve crimes and rated themselves on how many arrests they made. Instead, Bratton aimed to reduce the level of crime and gave his officers that mission, and if they didn't succeed, he found someone who did. He was very interested and puzzled to the very end about this radical decline in crime we've seen in the 90s and in the 2000s. And he traced it all back to the 60s when there was a decline in the sense that the way you live is through personal responsibility and personal self-control. He said that that led to wilder lifestyles, that led to higher crime rates, and then it was a stepping back from that caused the crime rate to come down. He wasn't sure why we were stepping back, but he became convinced that a moral sense, that a belief in personal responsibility was innate to humans, to human civilization, to humans as social creatures, and it was a rediscovering of that and a reinforcement of that led to the reduction in crime. He was a great believer in family and the importance of early influences, good parenting, churches, good schools, that sort of thing. In that way, he was a close colleague and ally of Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the person who coined the term defining deviancy down, and who was concerned very early in the 60s with the breakdown of the African-American family. Wilson and him were both allies in pushing this very unwelcome view that it was the decline in social mores and in traditional families that was leading to a lot of the problems in society. He described himself as a conservative among academics, but not a conservative among the average American. He was mild-mannered, and yet he was very sharp. He was enigmatic at times, and yet jolly, and took a real interest in everything about life and had this wonderful curiosity. He also had this other side to him. He loved fast cars. He was an intrepid scuba diver, and he once led an expedition to the bottom of the Truk Lagoon to examine the Japanese fleet that was sunk there. So he was a person of wide interest. And one of his favorite jobs, he told me, was on the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board during the 80s when the CIA was coming to terms with the fact that it was riddled with moles and double agents. And he was sort of a George Smiley character, helping the CIA come to terms with this and root out all of these double agents in its ranks. He was the definition of a public intellectual in America and was served the society in many ways for a long time. He was a great American.
So we have the death of two public conservatives who changed the way of thinking and in some small way changed our culture, something you have to admit whether you're a liberal or a conservative. I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer Sid Tepps, and my closing song tonight is going to be from an outlaw. Not a real outlaw, but one of the great country singers, Waylon Jennings, who sings about crime, outlaws, and his arrest. It's sort of a tribute to James Q. Wilson.
I'm for law and order, the way that it should be. The song's about the night they spent protecting